So we will get started with the reading. When you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you, put it in a basket, and go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. You shall go to the priest in charge at the time and say to him, I acknowledge this day before the Lord your God that I have entered the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to assign us. So what we are getting into is the idea of sacrifice, the idea of, as it mentioned, bringing the first fruits. This is developing a relationship with God, and the idea being that we have been liberated from Egypt. We are now bringing the products of our luxury, the products of our first labors in the promised land, and they are, of course, are a bountiful one. And we are giving it back to God. So we are creating this reciprocal relationship. In Kabbalistic thinking, the idea is that when we commit ourselves to commandments, to mitzvot, which is the sort of basis of Jewish life, that what we are doing is we are actually projecting up some of that God energy, and then God is then putting that back down to us. So it's creating this reciprocal relationship. And that's what's being talked about here. Skipping ahead to verse 6, the Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O Lord, have given me. So God gives us the ability to have these wonderful things, and it is natural for us to then give that back. So verse 12, we get into something interesting. When you have set aside in full the 10th part of your yield. So the 10th part. Does anyone know why that 10th part, what that is today called, the idea of giving a 10th? So this is a little Jewish pop quiz. And Christians do this as well. So if you're not Jewish, you may be familiar with this as well. What does the giving of 10, what is the sort of English word for that? Tithing. Good job, Jacob. Thank you. So weird to see that, and then I know they're right over here. So it's tithing. So what we've done is we have taken that idea, and Jeremiah, it's the tithe. We have taken that idea today. Jeremiah, they beat you, unfortunately. Well, they're right here in the room with me. So technically, they have about a 15-second, 10 to 15-second head start over everyone else, because there's a delay of 15 seconds between when I say something and when you guys hear it. So anyway, so they're total cheaters at this point. They have 15 seconds to look things up on Wikipedia if they don't know what it is.
I was a born again Christian.
Okay, there you go. So, right, okay. Anyway, so the idea of tithing, that's where that comes from this 10%. And so when you go into synagogues and you go into churches, I don't know, I believe Islam, that's actually one of the pillars of Islam, is the idea of giving a percentage of your income. That's where all of this comes from. In ethical monotheism, is from this particular line. I have a little water here. So that's where this idea comes from. And if you skip ahead to line 13, you shall declare before the Lord your God, I have cleared out the consecrated portion from the house, and I have given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, just as you commanded me. I have neither transgressed nor neglected any of your commandments. I have not eaten of it while in mourning. I have not cleared out any of it while I was unclean. I have not deposited any of it with the dead. I have obeyed the Lord my God. I have done just as you commanded me. So what this is talking about, the idea is that it's a social justice issue. So you have given it to the Levite. The Levite is the priest. So you're giving it to this spiritual authority figure who's going to do with it whatever the particular holy aspect may be. This is where the idea of giving to the synagogue or giving to the church comes from. You've also given it to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. So this is interesting because stranger, fatherless, and widow, that appears several times in the Torah. Why would that appear several times? Does anyone know why those particular things? It doesn't just say the poor or the neglected or whatever the case is. Why the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow? Does anyone know why specifically a widow has it worse than a widower or someone who lost a grandfather as opposed to losing a father? Any thoughts on that? I'm going to make you guys work for OneShul today. I'm going to make you actually answer questions because we have a small group today. I'm forcing you to be interactive. So Jeremiah says widows don't work. Absolutely. Jared says it's lose access to property. Yep, there you go. You got it. So the issue is that during this time, those were the most downtrodden people. Why the stranger? Because typically in this time period, if you were a stranger amongst a tribe that you did not know, if you were a foreigner, you were in a very vulnerable position. If you read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, unfortunately, it tends to be interpreted to talk about homosexuality. That's actually not what it's about. It was very common during this time that if you were a strange person wandering through a town or wandering through a nomadic community and people did not know you, they would rob you and rape you. And it did not matter what kind of person you were. Being a stranger, being a traveler was a very dangerous thing back then. You have to remember that these are people who live, it's, about a time when, there really was no hospitality, just as, Jeremiah is saying here. I mean, this was, for lack of a better word, this was a very savage time. You didn't have the idea of personal rights, personal laws, those civil liberties and civil protections back then. It really, when you traveled through one camp or another, it was up to the tribe to treat you however they wanted. So what Judaism is doing here is it's setting up a system of fairness. And why would we need to be kind to the stranger? Any particular reason why the stranger needs to be treated so well? I mean, we could be like the other tribes, and we could abuse people and neglect people. And I should say, going back to Sodom and Gomorrah, that's what that story is about. It's about the lack of hospitality, the fact that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah wanted to abuse the heavenly visitors because that was the culture back then. And Lot, of course, would have nothing of it because Lot was a righteous man. Jacob wins. We were strangers in Egypt. And Jared is about to make a really interesting point. So I can see that something's about to come up here. I'm going to wait until Jared makes his point. But Jacob is right. We were strangers in Egypt. So we are enforcing, as part of ethical monotheism, the idea of empathy. And the idea of being able to put ourselves in the same shoes as another person. One of the highlights of ethical monotheism, of ethical religion, of the axial age, which was a time in history where all of the great religions really just blew up all of a sudden, was the idea of the golden rule and the idea of treating others as they would wish to be treated. Now, Jared's making an excellent point. You never knew who would be a prophet or an angel, and that's absolutely true too. If you read, there's a lot of really interesting Talmudic discussions about it. I am not as well versed in these particular readings, but there is some interesting sort of folklorish writing about customs regarding seeing strangers. So it's things like if you're, I'm probably going to misquote this, but it's something like if you are walking down the street and you see someone coming upon you and it's dark, you shouldn't necessarily say Shalom Aleichem, because you don't know for sure who they are, and it could very well be that they are a demon. And that, I mean, this is some esoteric stuff, but it's, they could very well be a demon, and saying Malechem, referencing God to a demon will cause all kinds of crazy, supernatural, Ghostbusters style stuff. I'm not making this up. There actually is, I forget where it is. I need to look it up. My friend Alan, who's in a band called Stereo Sinai, actually told me this. But there's some really interesting writing about that. So there's a lot about the idea of the stranger. Getting into some more practical stuff, the widow we obviously talked about. The widow doesn't have a husband. A widow's not able to work. The fatherless, same idea. You have a whole family of people who do not have income coming in. And, also, this is a very patriarchal time. This is a time where essentially a woman's worth was making babies and having a dowry. So, of course, it would make sense that you would look to these people as the most downtrodden. Now, you get into line 14, and it's talking about the idea of mourning and the unclean and the dead and all of that. Judaism during this time it focuses on death and has a very interesting relationship to it. Touching a dead body, being around the dead, makes you ritually unclean. The issue with that, some people believe, is that Egyptian culture was a death cult. A lot of Egyptian mythology had to deal with the idea of the afterlife. There's very specific rules about organs that have to be taken out, about mummification, about what the afterlife is like, and which gods are involved in the afterlife. So people have argued that this is why Jewish culture doesn't focus on the afterlife, and in fact, if you look at Jewish burial practices, there's no embalming. You don't, cut the dead open as they did in the Egyptian pantheon, or the Egyptian cult, I should say. So the idea of being around the dead, there was a little bit of a thought back then that when you were around the dead, you invited death, like the spirit of death, into your home. So that may be the root of that. And line 16, the Lord your God commands you this day to observe these laws and rules. Observe them faithfully with all of your heart and all of your soul. So the Torah likes to copy itself all of the time. Where does heart and soul come from? It's actually extracted from somewhere else. Give up, heart and soul. I'll give you a hint. It's a prayer that starts with the letter Shin. 10-second rule, kids. 10, 9, 8, 7. I'm kidding. Okay, so it's the Shema. With all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might. So it's lifted from there. Jeremiah makes a point talking about the dead, probably why the Torah talks about shaving off all of your hair if you touch a corpse. That's very fair. I think that makes a lot of sense. So the idea being that when we follow one of these commandments, even if it seems kind of silly, we're actually glorifying God. So this is where people sometimes have issues with more of ritual Judaism. Why 10% of my income? Why not 9%? Why does it have to be 10? And it's this idea of whether it's something as mundane as, let's say, laying tefillin, or something as extremely holy as giving, 10% of your income, which is a huge amount of money. Particularly if you're lower income, it's very hard to give 10% of your income. Regardless, it's an equal playing field as far as mitzvot, as far as commandments. If you do one of these things, no matter how arbitrary it seems to you, you are glorifying God. And, it gets into that idea of godly logic, which is different from human logic. All right, so now we're at chapter 27. And I'm going to go down to verse 5. There too, is the idea of being in the promised land. There too you shall build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not wield an iron tool over them. You must build the altar of the Lord your God of unhewn, I hope that's how I pronounce that, unhewn stones. You shall offer on it burnt offerings to the Lord your God, and you shall sacrifice there offerings of well-being and eat them, rejoicing before the Lord your God. And on those stones you shall inscribe every word of this teaching most distinctly. So what does that have to do with anything? It is believed in this process of animal sacrifice and the cooking of this meat and the eating of this meat that in a way you are communing with God. I think it's very interesting that in Jewish culture we don't understand the Catholic rite of communion. It seems so weird, the idea that, you eat this cracker and somehow it becomes like the body of God. That seems really weird and uncomfortable. But in terms of ritual, that's kind of where this comes from. Now in Christianity, obviously, the whole idea of eating the cracker and all of that comes from the Last Supper story. But this idea of you can have a meal with a God, although in Judaism, obviously, we don't believe you're actually eating God, and we don't practice this animal sacrifice stuff anymore. This is where this comes from, the idea of you can share a meal with the divine in this way. This idea is later interpreted and later brought into the blessing after meals, the Birkat HaMazon. So if you're ever at a wedding, you're at a Jewish event, and you see the little blue books, and it has the blessings that you say after you eat, which, by the way, there are blessings before you eat, and there's blessings after you eat. When you take part in that ritual, you are actually taking a part in this ritual, because it stems from the same kind of thinking. You are, in a way, creating this altar at your table, and you are eating with God. God can't physically eat with you. God's not going to hang out, short of, the prophet, on Passover coming and sitting down and eating, with you, the prophet Elijah. You really can't eat with God, but in this way you can. God's not going to physically consume food, but if you eat and you say these blessings and you're bringing that energy back up to God, creating that Kabbalistic reciprocal relationship, then, in a way, God is eating with you. Jared says, would eating of the sacrifice also make sure the meat was of the right temperature to eat? That's a very good question. I really don't know. But that makes a lot of sense. It could have been a practical thing as well. Jewish food rituals during this time did have practical applications. Eating certain animals, there were health codes that were involved in that. Jared says, kind of like drinking of beer in the Middle Ages was better than drinking water. That could very well be true. I've never heard that before, but that makes a lot of sense. And I'll look into that, and I'll email you about that, because that makes a lot of sense. Could very well be. Let's see. So let's scroll down to verse 15, getting into the curses. So this is where it gets a little bit heavy. Cursed be anyone who makes a sculpted or molten image. Okay, so this is the idea of idolatry, and all the people shall respond, Amen. So starting at verse 15, we're actually getting into this sort of communal, it's basically a call and response prayer session. So the first thing is anti-idolatry. Second part, cursed be he who insults his father and mother. The people shall say, Amen. Cursed be he who moves his fellow countryman's landmark. And all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed be he who misdirects a blind person on his way. Amen. Cursed be he who subverts the rights of the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Again, repetition. Amen. Cursed be he who lies with his father's wife, for he has removed his father's garments. He shall say, Amen. Cursed be he who lies with his beast. Cursed be he who lies with his sister. Cursed be he who lies with his mother-in-law. So we're getting into sort of sexual morality in here. Cursed be he who strikes down his fellow countrymen in secret. Cursed be he who accepts a bribe in the case of the murder of an innocent person. Cursed be he who will not uphold the terms of this teaching and observe them. So we have this whole litany of different moral social codes. And, you know, a lot of times people get comfortable with sort of sexuality in the Bible. There are some very confusing aspects to it. You know, on one hand, the Bible teaches things that we could definitely get behind, like not sleeping with your, stepmother and things of that nature. In other times, there are more prickly, thorny parts that we have trouble with. And the wrestling, is a big part of this. What I think is interesting, if I can find it, because I've read it, but let me see which verse it is. Okay, so verse 24, cursed be he who strikes down his fellow countrymen in secret. So an interesting idea behind this is lashon hara, the idea of gossip, which actually translates to evil tongue. The idea that character assassination is just as bad as an actual assassination. This makes sense given the times that these people are living in. It's very hard to clear your name in this time. We don't have sort of an evidential process the way that we do now. When someone gossips about someone else and, posts something on Twitter or whatever the case may be, you can usually find some sort of evidence that will back you up and, and allow you to refute what someone says. Very hard to do this during this time. Now, connected with that is cursed be he who accepts a bribe in the case of the murder of an innocent person. These two ideas are connected together. Jared has a question, though. We'll answer that first. The idea that embarrassment drains blood from the head, so it equals murder? Possibly, yeah. That's fair. That's very fair. I want to talk a little bit about how verse 24 and 25 connect to each other. The idea of gossip and the idea of murder. It's very uncomfortable for some people that the Bible talks as much as it does about capital punishment. And, we read lines that say, their blood shall be upon them. You should stone them to death, things like that. I want to share with you an interesting teaching that I just recently learned. So I was at Lamud, which is a weekend in Atlanta. It's a weekend-long sort of summer camp for Jews and their families and young people and old people. It's just a great weekend-long event. There's classes, there's activities, and it's really geared towards all ages. And I filmed the God Project when I was there. I taught a couple of sessions, went to a lot of sessions. So one of the sessions I went to was actually improv, and I got to do acting, improv, which was actually really hard. I was very surprised by how nervous I was going in front of these people and trying to do improv. And it didn't help that one of my improvs that I had to do was I had to improvise that I was married to this girl who was doing improv with me, and she's this really beautiful Israeli woman. So I was really uncomfortable and had a lot of trouble with it. It was really awkward. We had to pretend that we were married, and we had to pretend that we hadn't yet consecrated our marriage and that we were about to do that. So it was this really awkward, uncomfortable thing, and I have to do this in front of all of these people. Sorry, my nose itches. But anyway, so so I'm at this improv thing, and one of the improvs that they did was the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin was the Jewish court. It was the ultimate bet din. And they tried over all of the big cases. So think of like the first century, Israelite Supreme Court. That's basically what you have. And it was before the first century as well. But this is, the Talmudic time. And so here's the example they used. Sorry, my nose itches. I don't know why. I know if your ear itches, that means that someone's talking about you. I don't know what nose itching is. My mother tells me to stop scratching my nose so much when I do these classes, so maybe that's it. So they're using the example of a murder case. So you have this guy who is standing in front of someone, and he shoots them. Now, obviously, you wouldn't have had a gun back then, but they're being a little bit liberal with the concept. So this guy kills this other guy, and there's two witnesses. And he goes through this whole process where the people in the audience are the Sanhedrin. And we have to make a decision about the murder case. So here's what it takes for capital punishment to be administered. So you have to have a victim, obviously, and you have to have the criminal, the murderer. You have to have two independent witnesses. So you have to have two witnesses who are of legal age during this time, who have to be independent of each other, so they can't know each other at all. They both have to have witnessed this situation. Then you have to have two other people who also witnessed it. So you have witnesses witnessing witnessing the crime. So you've got 4 people at this point. And the 2 key witnesses have to have warned the killer that what he or she was doing was a crime. So you have to have 2 witnesses who watch 2 witnesses who say to the criminal, you are about to commit a crime. On top of this, the criminal has to say, I know that I am committing a crime. I am going to kill this person anyway. I'll be damned if, I deserve the death penalty. So you have to have all of this happen at once, and everyone has to be independent of each other. So the 2 sort of extraneous witnesses have to be independent of each other. The 2 witnesses, the 2 warners, have to be independent of each other. All 4 of these people have to be independent of each other, the warners and the witnesses. And then on top of that, the victim and the murderer have to be independent of each other and everyone else. So you're dealing with 6 people who all at the exact same time have to do certain things, and they all have to be independent of each other. So that's a whole lot of division between the criminal and the killer. So let me ask you this question. You guys get to be the Sanhedrin. If there's 2 witnesses who witness 2 warners, everyone independent of each other, we'll take that for granted, everyone independent of each other, and the 2 witnesses see the 2 warners, warn the criminal, if you kill that guy, then it is murder and you will be put to death. The murderer says, I'm going to do it anyway, kills the guy, everyone goes in front of the Sanhedrin. Does the murderer deserve to be, from the Sanhedrin's standpoint, does the murderer deserve to be stoned to death? What is your opinion? So you have a lot going on there. I mean, if you could pull that off, that's a lot. It kind of doesn't get any more, it doesn't get any more legit than that, This is not exactly, CSI Miami or Law and Order, but, I mean, that's pretty good for, Bible times, as it were. In your opinion, if you were the Sanhedrin, would you say, you know what? Even if you don't believe in the death penalty, we're gonna stay away from that. Stay away from that moral issue. But just from a legal standpoint, that's the law of the land. Would you be comfortable saying, you know what, that's the law, he deserves it? Jared has a very big point, and he's put 3 dots after his butt. So I'm going to wait a minute for that. I should also note that there is this amazing tabbouleh salad that's in front of me, and as much as I'm enjoying being here at OneShul, I can't wait until I get to have some of that. So while Jared is typing this grand thesis, which I'm sure is going to be the ultimate answer, does anyone have any really quick thoughts? Yes or no? You're the Sanhedrin. You get to make this decision. Jared says, wouldn't you also require the witness to have some part in not stopping the murder? Yeah, so that is true. So you have to have and I should have kind of maybe said more about that. So the witnesses have to try to stop the murder, and that's where the warning is. So you have to have this warning, otherwise it's, if any of these little pieces... If any of these pieces is out of order, if one person knows another person, if there was no warner, if there was only one witness and not two, all of this invalidates it. So you're right, Jared. In that case, yeah, you do need to have that person who tries to take part in stopping the murder. Jeremiah says, yes, it's basically the equivalent of killing someone on live TV. Okay, so we have one person who says yes, and I guess Jacob is saying yes as well. So let's see, we have 4 people who are logged in, so we have 2 yeses. So we could have a tied vote. We could keep the murderer from being killed. We just need 2 more people to say yes or no. Anyone else want to weigh in on this? Our hypothetical person is about to be stoned to death with these 2 yeses. I don't count. Jeremiah says, I'm basing that on the number of witnesses. Yes. You have 4 people basically independent of each other, and all of the blocks that have been set up to, all of the blocks, all of the restrictions have been set up for the death penalty. And, Jeremiah, you're making an awesome point. And you could very well be right. Okay, so here's what the Sanhedrin would actually say. 2 witnesses who see 2 warners say, if you kill this man, you have committed a murder. The man says, you know what, I don't care, kills the guy. Everyone's independent of each other. All of the halacha, all of the Jewish law lines up. He's still not going to get the death penalty, even with all of that, because the Sanhedrin said you would have to be crazy to kill someone after 2 people independent of each other have warned you that you are committing a crime and 2 other witnesses have seen you do it. The Sanhedrin takes for granted that any person who would be so immoral as to commit a crime in that way is so whacked out of their mind that killing them would be killing a mentally ill person, that you would be insane to do that. And so they would not institute the death penalty for that, because they would think you are not culpable because clearly you are just out of your mind. And you would not want to kill someone who is out of their mind because they could not understand the ramifications of what they were doing. So, this is a really interesting thing, that when we read, this idea of stoning someone to death and all of these other things, you have to take into account that this would have been nearly impossible to pull off. So when you read, their blood shall be upon them, do remember that any of these instances where the death penalty is possible, you had such extreme legal precedent that it really didn't happen. And so Jacob makes the point that's a pretty clever way to legislate away the death penalty. Yep, absolutely. Jared says that stance on mental health is pretty advanced. It is. It really is. I really did not know that. I had taken for granted for so long that... we were a very murderous cult back then, but we weren't. The Sanhedrin, I think, because of the influence of Christianity in America and in Europe, Jews haven't really claimed the Sanhedrin as being an acceptable thing. When we think of Sanhedrin, we think of this authoritative group that's going to kill you and, all these things. Really, those dudes wanted to do as little damage as possible. So, interesting thing with 24 and 25 there. Okay, now we're getting into another interesting piece of poetry. We're in the next chapter, chapter 28, verse 3. Picking up, interestingly, I was talking about the idea of the Sanhedrin, where as Jews were uncomfortable of claiming the Sanhedrin because of Christianity's influence and the idea that Jesus was killed by the Sanhedrin, and so now, because of anti-Semitism, we feel a little uncomfortable with it. Here's an interesting thing. There's a poetry that existed back in this time, which the early Christians took on, and it starts with verse 3. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall be the issue of your womb, the produce of your soil, and offspring of your cattle. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall be in your comings, and blessed shall be shall you be in your goings. So people, I think, because they don't know, often attribute this blessed are kind of poetic style to the Beatitudes, to sort of it being a Christian thing or a Jesus thing. It's actually not. That was a poetic style that was very common back then. And you can see that in the book of Deuteronomy. So it's kind of an interesting linguistic thing. Getting into verse 7, the idea of, God being with you, God ordaining all of these rules. And the idea that because we live a holy life, because we live a certain way that we do, because we follow the mitzvot, the other nations will see us and they will fear us. Now, what does it mean to fear? Does it mean that they'll be terrified of us? It talks in the Bible about the fear of God, and it's really not fear in the sense of, oh no, it's not that kind of fear. It's actually awe. It's the idea of being just overwhelmed by something. When it talks about fearing the Jewish people or fearing God, it's not talking about being afraid. It's talking about the idea of being so overwhelmed and so taken by an experience, whether it's an experience of connecting with God or whether it's the experience of seeing the way in which the Hebrews live, that fear is put into us, that sense of, wow, these people are really doing right, and that sense of creating a moral nation that other people can look up to. The idea, of course, in Judaism that we are to set an example. However, we get to verse 15. But if you do not obey the Lord your God, ... fill in the blank, everything will be cursed. Everything that was blessed will be cursed. Verse 20, the Lord will let loose against you calamity, panic, and frustration in all of the enterprises you undertake, so that you shall soon be utterly wiped out because of your evil doing in forsaking me. The Lord will make pestilence cling to you until he has put an end to your land that you are entering to possess. The Lord will strike you with consumption, fear, and inflammation, with scorching heat and drought, with blight and mildew. It gets even worse than that. Looking at verse 26, your carcasses shall become food for all the birds of the sky and all of the beasts of the earth. Verse 27, the Lord will strike you with the Egyptian inflammation. This is kind of funny, with hemorrhoids, boil scars and itch from which you shall never recover. The Lord will strike you with madness, blindness, and dismay. So a lot of heavy stuff. Verse 30, if you pay the bride price for a wife, So you have this, this idea of giving money to a family. Another man shall enjoy her. If you build a house, you will not live in it. If you plant a vineyard, you will not harvest it. So pretty much anything that you do, you are never going to be able to enjoy. And so, why is that? It's because you have not lived up to this reciprocal relationship. God has freed us from Egypt. The least we could do would be to give up a certain part of ourselves and to recognize this holiness and to recognize this covenant that we live in. Getting into verse 45, all these curses shall befall you. They shall pursue you and overtake you. Okay, so pursuing and overtaking, the idea of a curse pursuing us. I think that's an interesting idea, because if you don't believe literally that, God's going to throw down the lightning bolts, as it were, there's an interesting psychological way of looking at this. You think of a teenager, as an example, who's maybe out having sex, smoking pot, doing whatever, drinking, and, committing crime. So you have, what parents say, trouble is going to follow you. So it's a similar idea. It's an idea that if you are doing these kind of antisocial behaviors, if you're doing these things you're not supposed to be doing within sort of civilized society, which is what this week's Torah portion is talking about, the idea of the civil, ethical world, this trouble is going to follow you, and eventually it's going to overtake you. If you allow the Yetzer Hara, that animal side, to be everything for you, then eventually you're going to be overwhelmed by it. You are going to suffer the consequences of the fact that you have, allowed your ego and allowed yourself, your id, as Freudian people would say, to really be, what you live for, as opposed to God and community and, being righteous and all of these other things. And it continues on with this, and it talks about all kinds of just gross stuff that I'm not going to get into, because it's disgusting. But nevertheless, it continues to go on. It talks about the idea of practicing idolatry and what happens, in that kind of case. And finally it ends, these are the terms of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to conclude with the Israelites in the land of Moab, in addition to the covenant which he had made with them at Horeb. So this idea of covenant is interesting. If you look at the way that the Torah is written in this sort of place, and then you look at other legal documents that were written around the same time, what's interesting is that we could say that the Torah is very poetic, that it's a beautiful piece of poetry. Jeremiah has to get going. Good to see you, buddy. Thank you for your help today. I'm really excited about... Jeremiah did some great stuff, and I'll gloat about him, later, I guess. He doesn't get to hear me gloat about him. But anyway... Jeremiah did some awesome stuff. I'll tell you about that later. In any case, if you look at legal documents that were written around the same time, something as simple as, these names, I'm going to be facetious with the names, but, Shmuel sells, Mordecai a cow, and the cow is this price, and, Shmuel agrees that the cow is in this kind of shape, and if it's not, Mordecai has the right to sue Shmuel in, court, and, he gets, an extra pound of brisket, or whatever the case is. That kind of very mundane legal code, it actually, the language is very similar to what's in the Torah. When the ancient Israelites were read the Torah portions every 7 years, you have to remember people didn't have Torah scrolls at home. They listened to the Torah every 7 years being read during the Jubilee year. This is what it would have sounded like. It would have sounded like Party A, otherwise known as the Israelites, enters into a covenant with Party B, further known as God, In so much as Party B has liberated Party A from the land of Egypt, in return, Party A agrees to the following. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and your soul and your might. You shall do this, that, and the other. And here too, if contract is broken, the Party B, known as God, has the right to strike you dead. I mean, that's really what it would have sounded like. It would have sounded like this very, sort of important civil legal code. And I think that's really funny because we wouldn't necessarily think that as sacred literature. If the Bible were translated in that way and read in that way, it wouldn't seem sort of poetic at all. And it wasn't. This was not poetry. This was a binding legal contract between the people and God. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So I'm going to leave it at that. If you want to read chapter 29, verses 1 through 8 or whatever the case may be, you're free to do that. Instead, I'm just going to let you know about the God Project. So the God Project dropped today. We have 117 videos up on the God Project website. You go to it, it's www.the-d-project.org. You can check out all of those great videos. Of course, we always need help with donations. If you're interested in giving a donation, you know what? If you enjoyed this class, $5. What's $5? That's actually the price of a cup of coffee now, because the coffee beans, the price of coffee beans has gone up so dramatically. So what's $5 between friends? It's a little piece. It's a little fruit that you're giving up to the OneShul community to help us keep things free. Because you know what? There's people who can't give $5. And we don't want those people to be forced into a situation where they have to. So if we give $5, it's not that we're giving $5. It's that we're giving $5 so someone else doesn't have to. So that's really what it's about. So if you can do that, PayPal, PunkTorah at gmail.com. And you can do it that way, or you can give a donation in the mail. You can go on any of our websites, the God Project, PunkTorah, OneShul.org, NewKosher.org, and there's donate buttons everywhere, and all of the information on how to donate. So whatever you're into, you can go on any of those websites and donate directly to that specific cause or whatever the case is. This is the only class that we have this week. We had Shabbat services last Friday, so we don't have anything else going on the rest of this week. So I would encourage you, go on the God Project website, comments, watch the videos and make comments. Make your own God Project video and send us the YouTube link or send us the raw footage. We'll edit it and put it up on the website. That would be the greatest thing. If you could do that this week, I would greatly appreciate it. So, once again, thank you for coming to OneShul. It's great to be in a community with you, and I look forward to seeing you next week, next Monday, for the next Torah Together. Take care.